Morning. We're talking about Christian community. The Bible tells us that from the very beginning of human history, we were created for community. We were created to be meaningfully connected in vital relationships with others. God put Adam in the garden. You know the story. The conditions in the Garden of Eden were absolutely perfect. There was nothing lacking there. The garden was unmarred by the effects of sin, and yet, even in that condition, God said of the very first man, it's not good for him to be alone, right? And as a result of this observation, God created human community. God created us to live in community. And as further evidence of our God-designed need for community, the Bible tells us that in the exact same way that God has eternally existed in community himself, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, God has eternally existed himself in community with others. And so too, Genesis tells us that God created us to be like him in his own image. And so too, we, like our Creator God, were created for community. We have a hardwired need for relationships. No one was ever created to fly solo in life. In the heart of every single one of us, there is a God-given need to connect with others, a God-given need to belong. And so biblical affirmations aside, I think every one of us knows that, human nature, just our knowledge of human nature tells us that we need to be vitally connected with others in meaningful relationships. We've made the observation before that the very worst form of punishment is what? Solitary confinement. Zucchini. I thought I heard somebody say zucchini, but even worse than zucchini is solitary confinement. Right? Human nature tells us that we have this need to be meaningfully connected with others. I just recently finished reading Alexander Solzhenitsyn's classic novel, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which is really an autobiographical story of Solzhenitsyn's own personal experience in a Soviet gulag, a forced labor camp in Siberia. And what was interesting in this story was just to observe that in the impossible conditions in a Soviet gulag, despite the near constant below freezing conditions. It's like 30 below all the time. That's on a good warm day in one of these gulags. And just the meager rations that they were given, the brutality of the guards and the back-breaking labor that the prisoners had to do, and then even the hopelessness that they had that they would ever get out of the gulag alive. What Solzhenitsyn writes into the experience of the main character, Ivan Denisovich, who's called Shukov in the book, Shukov was still able to carve out purpose for his existence in a Soviet gulag through community. It was really still community that got him through the day. It was loyalty, it was friendships, it was generosity to the other prisoners. And interestingly, it was also through even the hard labor, Shukov found meaning in the work of his hands. And I think that's just a brilliant picture of how we find purpose in life. It's through meaningful connection with and service to others. But anyway, the point I'm wanting to make here, it was interesting to note that in the book, Solzhenitsyn makes the observation that if a prisoner in a Soviet gulag was confined to solitary confinement for 15 days, it was tantamount to a death sentence. Nobody ever survived in the harsh Siberian conditions more than 15 days of solitary confinement. And so the point I'm just simply making is that it's a universal truth of our humanity. Whether you're a human being in a Siberian prison camp or you're a human being in a rural Indiana church on a Sunday morning, you were created by God to live your life in meaningful connection with others and in service to others. And so that's why here at the Vineyard Community Church, just by virtue of the biblical command to be in fellowship with one another, and by, virtual with this, anthropological and sociological observation and conviction of our need for community. That's why here at the Vineyard Community Church, we have stated in our mission statement that we exist as a church to help you do life together. Do life together. That's connection that we're commanded to have, and that's connection that we know we need to have. Do life together as we follow Jesus and serve others together. And so that's then also why at this church, if you call the Vineyard Community Church your church home, we expect you to be part of a small group. It's that simple, because the Bible tells us that we are supposed to be in community with one another. We talked about this last week. You can't belong in a Sunday morning crowd. If your only point of connection with this church is a crowd connection here on Sunday morning, you don't belong, because you can't belong in a crowd. You're just a nameless face in a large group of people. You can't be vitally and meaningfully connected in relationships as one of several hundred people. It just doesn't work that way. And so if you're not an Alpha or Beta or Vine, if you're not already signed up for one of our fall offerings of life groups, check out the display at the table in the end zone back there. And sign up for a group where you can practice living out your life in meaningful connection with others and service to others in a small group. All right, so here's the problem. That's all by way of introduction. Here's our problem, is that it's really easy to get disconnected. We're created to be connected. It's easy to get disconnected. Do you know that one? Yeah, it's easy to get disconnected from your parents, from your brothers, from your sisters, your family, your friends, from your husband, from your wife, from your children. It's easy to get disconnected from the community of faith. And so today we're going to look at this problem of disconnection. We're going to look at failure in the community of faith. And more importantly, we're going to look at what lessons we can learn from Jesus' example, for how Jesus responded to failure in the community with which he had surrounded himself. We're going to again look at Matthew 26. Last week, we looked at this passage. We began in verses 36 through 38, and we saw, just very quickly by way of review, several ingredients of Christian community that were demonstrated for us by Jesus' own example. And this is what we saw. So picking up in verse 36 again, Matthew 26, says, Jesus went with them to the olive grove called Gethsemane. The context, if you missed it last week, was just shortly before Jesus would be tried and executed. And so he's got his group of followers with him. He brought them to Gethsemane, and he said to them, sit here while I go over there to pray. And then he took Peter and Zebedee's two sons, James and John. So he pulled aside a group of battle buddies, a small group, Jesus' life group, so to speak, a group of 4 men. And he pulled them aside, and he became anguished and distressed, and he told them, my soul is crushed with grief to the point of death, and so stay here and keep watch with me. Hang with me, guys. Hang with me. Cover my back in this. And so in Jesus' example, we saw these 4 important ingredients of Christian community. The first ingredient we saw is intimacy, and by this we meant the necessity of being meaningfully connected with a small group of battle buddies in the faith. And I've already talked about this by way of introduction this morning, but by way of review, we see in Jesus this example that the ups and downs we face in life are best faced not in isolation and nor as a nameless face in a crowd, but rather in the context of being meaningfully connected with a small group of battle buddies. Right? That's intimacy. Right? The second ingredient we learn from Jesus' example is intentionality. Intentionality. Authentic Christian community with a small group of battle buddies does not happen by accident. It will not happen by accident. If you are waiting for it to just magically develop between you and other people, it's not going to happen. You have to exert intentional effort to form and to maintain authentic community. The third ingredient we learned last week from Jesus' example is transparency. Jesus himself demonstrated the need to get real. He was honest with his battle buddies. Hey, life is not going well right now. He had to get real with himself. He had to get real with God and get real with others in community. And that's important. It's critical for us because real growth in life You know, victory, particularly over the struggles that we face in life, the struggles that are getting us down, happens through honest disclosure. It happens through honest disclosure in the context of safe relationships. So transparency is the third ingredient. And lastly, by way of review, the fourth ingredient we learn from Jesus' example is prayer. Prayer. Jesus, the Son of God himself, demonstrated for us the importance of being part of a small group of battle buddies who will pray you through the ups and downs of life. Think about that. Jesus asked his buddies to be praying for him. That tells us something. If Jesus needed that in his life, how much more do you? How much more do I need that in my life? And so that's quickly by way of review. This morning we pick up where we left off last week. I'm going to read verse 36 again and to set up the context. So we read this. Then Jesus went with them to the olive grove called Gethsemane, and he said, "Sit here while I go over there to pray." And he took Peter and Zebedee's two sons, James and John, and he became anguished and distressed. And he told them, "My soul is crushed with grief to the point of death, so stay here and keep watch with me." So what happens next? He went on a little farther and bowed with his face to the ground, praying, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup of suffering be taken away from me, yet I want your will to be done, not mine." And then he returned to the disciples, his battle buddies, and he found them asleep. And he said to Peter, "Couldn't you watch with me even 1 hour?" Right? Keep watch and pray. He's again repeating his desire, his need for his battle buddies. Keep watch and pray so that you will not give in to temptation, for the spirit is willing, but the body is weak. So Jesus left them a second time and prayed, "My Father, if this cup cannot be taken away unless I drink it, your will be done." And when he returned to them again, he found them sleeping, for they couldn't keep their eyes open. And so he went to pray a third time, saying the same things again, and then he came back to the disciples and said, "Go ahead and sleep. Have your rest. Take a snooze, guys. But look, the time has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. So up, let's be going. Look, my betrayer is here." And so what I love about this passage is the honesty with which it portrays the community of faith. There's no photoshopping of the story here. Jesus' community of faith failed him. It failed him in his hour of need. And so here's the first very, very important fact for you to tuck away. Christian community will fail. Let's say that together. Christian community will fail. And Christian community will fail you. It'll fail you. So just tuck that away for when you're going to need it, because you're going to need it. Christian community will fail you. And why is that? It's because the Christian community is made up of failures just like you and me, right? Yeah. Failures who have been saved by the grace of Jesus, and failures who are in the process of being transformed by the grace of Jesus. And though we're hopefully getting a little bit closer each day to having the character of Christ more fully formed in us, most of you aren't there yet. And most of us aren't there yet. And that means we will inevitably fail, right? So listen to this then. Too many Christians, when failed by the community of faith, respond with well, I'm just going to take my marbles and go home then. I'm just going to take my marbles and go home. And as a result, when we bail on working through failure in relationships, when we bail on working through failure in the community of faith, it stunts our growth. It absolutely stunts our growth. It stunts our growth emotionally. It stunts our growth relationally. It stunts our growth spiritually. And so you show me somebody who's bailed on Christian community when it's failed, and I'll show you somebody who has just simply stopped growing in the faith. It's that simple. And what's more, you show me somebody who's bailed on Christian community just because it's failed, and I'll show you someone who's going to keep running into the exact same relational sticking points over and over and over and over again, right? Because wherever we go, there we are. Wherever we go, there we are. And we'll just keep running into that same test over and over again. Why? Because God, in his incredible mercy, is too kind to let us ever fail a test. Right? He will graciously allow us to take that same test over and over again until we pass. Isn't that kind of him? It's really kind. And so failure in the community of faith is an opportunity for us to grow, not an excuse to go. Opportunity to grow, not an excuse to go. And in fact, in 1 Corinthians 11:19, we're told that failure in the community of faith is a necessity. It's a necessary proving ground of our faith. If we have that slide, breakdown is proving ground, 1 Corinthians 11:19. But of course, there must be divisions among you. Apostle Paul is writing to the Corinthian church that was just plagued with divisions. But of course, there must be divisions among you so that you who have God's approval will be evident. And so conflict in the community of faith is a testing ground of our faith. And the way that we respond to failure in the community of faith demonstrates who is getting God's education and who's skipping school. Breakdown is proving ground. And so what we're going to see this morning then is not only that failure in the community of faith inevitably happens, but we're going to see in Jesus' example that he didn't bail. He didn't take his marbles and go home when his battle buddies failed him. He instead modeled for us example of how to respond when the community of faith fails. And so this is the first thing that we see in Jesus' example, is that he was persistent. Jesus was persistent. Picking up in verse 37, Jesus took his battle buddies aside, Peter, James, and John. He became anguished and distressed, and he told them, "My soul is crushed with grief to the point of death. Stay here and watch with me." Verse 39, he went on a little farther. He bowed to the ground praying, and then when he returned, verse 40, to the disciples, he found them asleep. He said to Peter, "Couldn't you watch with me for even 1 hour? Keep watch and pray so that you will not give in to temptation, for the spirit is willing, the body is weak." Verse 42, he left them a second time to continue to pray, and when he returned in verse 43 again, he found them sleeping. They couldn't keep their eyes open. All right, we already read that, but just to show you that Jesus persisted. He kept going back. His request to his buddies, his request to his battle buddies had been pretty clear. Just hang with me, guys. I need you to watch my back. I need you to cover me in prayer. I'm going through a tough time right now, and I really need for you guys just to be hanging with me. And yet, repeatedly, Jesus found his battle buddies asleep on the job again and again and again. And Jesus' small group failed him. They let him down, and they weren't there for him when he needed them. But the lesson that we learn from Jesus' example here is persistence. Jesus just kept persisting in putting his request out there. He kept coming back and putting himself out there again and again. Come on, guys, I need you. Come on, guys, I really need you to be with me in this. And that example of persistence is the model we need to follow when community fails. Persistence. Persistence. We need to keep on putting ourselves out there. Right? Let me tell you what we too often do. We too often punt rather than persist. We too often punt rather than persist, and we punt in various ways. You know, some people have a one swing and you're out response. We've already talked about this. It's the fail me once and I'm taking my marbles and I'm running. I'm going to go somewhere else where there's perfect Christians who will never fail me. Right? That's punting. With that, we punt on Christian community by writing off brothers and sisters in Christ as hypocrites because they fail us. They're fake because they fail us. Right? They fail us just as imperfect people are inevitably want to do, right? It's not hypocrisy necessarily, it's just failure. But we write them off because they let us down. I've seen people retreat into isolation as a punt response to failure. You know, making some sort of vow that says something like this: I will never entrust myself to a person again. I knew it was stupid to try to depend on somebody, to put myself out there for someone else, and I will never make that mistake again. And we slam the door to the possibility that anyone in the community of faith could ever do anything but be unreliable and untrustworthy. We slam the door on experiencing some sort of different future than the one we're condemned to relive over and over again. Or when community fails, I've seen people turn requests into demands, and demands can take a lot of different forms. There can be explicitly overt demands. You can't fail me. You must not ever let me down. I one time, in my experience as a pastor, had a person demand that, I basically as a pastor should have like this omniscient awareness of everything that they are going through in life. There's just like, you should know this, Kent. It's like, well, okay. And the expectation that in omnisciently knowing these things, I should call them whenever they're going through down times in life. And I explained to them, I can't do that for you. Nobody can do that for you. The only person who has an omniscient awareness of what is going on in your life is God. Everybody else you got to call to let them know what's going on, right? We can get demanding as a way of really punting on authentic community. It really is a way of expecting community to be perfect, and it's an unrealistic expectation. And with that, sometimes our demand can be the unrealistic demand that people never, ever, ever fail us again. All right, I'll roll the dice with you again, but don't you ever fail me. Don't ever do that again. All right? And that's an unrealistic expectation. And sometimes we can wrongly respond to failure in the community of faith with manipulation. We can manipulatively shame people to never fail us, or to attempt to never fail us, or manipulatively strong-arm others to not fail us, or guilt people to not fail us. I've seen people take on this really manipulative pretense of becoming very giving to others, but it's really a way of demanding response, unfailing response from other peoples. And so anyway, what I'm just trying to portray for you are the various different ways that rather than persisting in authentic community, we kick into a punt response mode. And whatever form those punt responses take, our punt strategies usually have the exact opposite effect on community than what we actually desire. Rather than drawing people in, rather than drawing them closer in, we push them away. Rather than building vital connection with others that we actually wanted in the first place, we end up killing community, not creating community. And so Jesus avoided the common punt responses that we often employ to failure in the community of faith through persistence. Jesus just simply persisted in putting his request out there. And so my encouragement to you, people of the Vineyard Community Church who are walking in obedience to the God-given command to be connected in community, and you're making that choice to do this here in an imperfect church, persist. Keep persisting. And keep putting yourself out there in an imperfect community of faith. All right, persistence. Secondly, in the same way that Jesus was persistent, he was also honest about failure in the community of faith. Verse 40 said, when Jesus returned to the disciples and he found them asleep, he put it out there. He said to Peter, what? Can't you even stay awake? Can't you even stay awake just for 1 hour? All right? Keep watch and pray so that you will not give in to temptation, for the spirit is willing and the body is weak. And we could read, 2 more times that Jesus found the community of faith failing and just putting out there, hey guys, this is what is going on right now. I'm just shooting straight with you. And so Jesus was gut level honest with his battle buddies about what was happening. And he did it in such a way that he was walking this fine line between not manipulating them, not strong-arming them, not shaming them, not demanding them on the one hand, and yet on the other side, not really pulling his punches on the other. He wasn't muting the impact of their failure that their failure had on him. Jesus was perfectly loving to his buddies, and at the same time, he was speaking difficult truth to them. He was honest. And I'd like to suggest to you that every single one of us here needs to grow in our ability to be loving truth tellers. To be loving truth tellers. And that's a very difficult stance to maintain. We've talked about this before. Most of us fall short by either erring on one side or the other. We err to the side of being loving people but not really telling the truth. Right? That's easy to do. Or we err on the side of being truth-telling people. Let me tell you how it really is, but not being very loving. Right? Some people fail on the side of not being loving or truth-telling. That's really bad. It's hard work to stay personally committed to a stance that is both loving and truthful. But that's what Jesus modeled, and that's how we ought be. I'd love to see us as a community of faith continue to grow in our ability to cultivate a culture where there's space, where we create space for one another to give and to receive Christ-like, loving, truthful feedback to one another. A safe place for that to happen. And so honesty is the second important ingredient of our response to failure in the community of faith. And then very lastly, in Jesus' response, we see modeled acceptance and commitment. Acceptance and commitment. Jesus' acceptance of and his commitment to an imperfect community of faith. And we can see it in these words. Verse 43, Jesus returned to them again. He found them sleeping, for they just couldn't keep their eyes open. They just couldn't do it. They couldn't keep their eyes open, right? It's like some of you right now. You just can't keep your eyes open. I get it, right? And then verse 45, I don't have these words on the screen. And then he came to the disciples and said, go ahead and sleep. Just go ahead. Get comfortable. Have your rest. And so Jesus understood here that his battle buddies were not only weary, right? They were battle weary, but moreover, these were just weak guys. These were flawed guys. And Jesus accepted his community for what it was, right? This is an imperfect community. These are imperfect guys. And Jesus accepted them for what they were, even though it had personally failed him. They had personally failed him. They had personally hurt him. And Jesus had grace to accept, a community of faith that's not perfect. Jesus had grace to accept a community of faith that fails. And Jesus had grace, listen to this, Jesus had grace to accept the reality that it was virtually impossible for the community of faith to act otherwise. Does that make sense? Jesus, by grace, accepted the fact that it's virtually impossible for the community of faith to act otherwise than to fail. That's realistic grace. Realistic grace that we should follow Jesus' example and extend towards one another. The realistic expectation that it's virtually impossible that we would not fail each other. That's acceptance of community. And then Jesus' acceptance of his imperfect community was demonstrated through continued commitment to that very community of faith that failed him. Within a matter of hours of that failure, Jesus would give his life for that very group of battle buddies that failed him. That's commitment. It's acceptance and commitment. Jesus would, after his resurrection, return to that very group of battle buddies who had failed him to reestablish relationship, right? To reestablish community with them once again and again. Just demonstration of acceptance of an imperfect and flawed community of faith and commitment to keep persisting with that flawed community of faith. And so we need to follow Christ's example and demonstrate acceptance, gracious acceptance of our flawed community and gracious commitment to our flawed community of faith when it fails.